Being a software engineer is tough, whether you're working 9 to 5 or if you're an entrepreneur who's working 24/7, it's a bit difficult to kind of work on all the things and also to focus on earning money. Now, this video is about how you can earn passive income by creating an API that you can publish somewhere and it will bring you money passively. This video is going to teach you how to create a project with Express and Node.js, how to use Rapid API Hub to publish your API to Rapid API, how to validate the data that is coming to your API, how to connect to a MongoDB database, how to deploy your applications to Heroku, and how to select a plan that can make you money passively. So if you're excited about this video, so am I, and by the end of this video you will have a working API that others can use and potentially pay you for. So let's get started. So the first thing that you need to do is go to rapidapi.com/hub, and Rapid API is essentially the sponsor for this video. So a huge shout out to them for helping us make this video. Rapid API Hub is essentially a hub of a lot of APIs that you can use. Some of them are absolutely free. Some of them have freemium plan where you can have some free requests and then you have to pay for any additional API calls. Now what you want to do is go there and sign up, and you can use your Google account or your GitHub account, and I have used my GitHub account to log in. Once you have done, you can try to find out any APIs that you want to work with, but this tutorial is about creating those APIs. So I'm going to show you how to do that. The first way to do that is to go to my APIs and then you can create an API from there. We call this the provider dashboard. Now this dashboard is supposed to help you create your new API projects or to maintain your existing one. But what's interesting is that we are not going to use this one yet. We are going to use something that's not out there yet. Ooh, it's a beta function and you are probably going to be the first one checking this out. We are calling it the Rapid API Builder. So you go to rapidapi.com/build and you can basically create an API project right from the builder. So we are going to create a project here. We're going to call this Scorer Pro because the API that we are going to create will be a scoring API. So what the user of this API or the developer would essentially be able to add scores by providing a game ID, a user ID, and the score value. And this is why we are calling it Scorer Pro. And the description would be an API to add, retrieve, and manage scores for games. And that is pretty much it. We're going to go and select the category of gaming in this one. We're going to keep this personal and just click the Add API project. And as we do so, we are now provided with a really nice interface, which is a REST API client. And this is amazing because you might have used Postman or Insomnia before, but this right here is the REST API client that is directly linked with your API project. So now that we have created this here, if I try to go to the provider dashboard and refresh, I should be able to see my API project right here. And there you go. You can see that we now got this Scorer Pro API, which has a definition. We can see the analytics, but we are going to go into all of this later in the stage. Let's go back to the API client. Now in here, we can essentially add a couple of requests, then we can test out while development, and we can also manage environments. We're going to get into that in just a bit, but first we have to create this project and get started with creating the APIs. In order to do so, I'm assuming that you have Node.js installed. If you don't have it, you need to go to nodejs.org/en/download and then download the Node.js version based on your operating system. Make sure to download the LTS version. You will also need Git to be able to push this code to GitHub or to push this to Heroku when we are going to deploy it to production. Once you have downloaded those two things, you should be able to go to your terminal or command prompt and type node-version, and you should be able to see the version of Node.js that you're installing here. Now that we have done this, we need to create an Express.js project to get started. For this, the best thing to do is to go to the documentation. That's what we developers do. We go there, we find out how to make things work, we copy and paste, and we get paid for this one. So you need to go to getting started, and here you can see Express Generator. And once you come to this page, you can basically copy this command called npx express generator. Now this command has to be run in the project folder. Right now we don't have our project folder, so we are going to do mkdir and we are going to call this Scorer-Pro, and here we are going to hit enter. Then we're going to cd into Scorer Pro just like this, and now we can run the npm npx express generator. This basically generates the Express JS application for us, and now we should be able to just open it into one of our favorite IDEs. I will be using Visual Studio Code for this one, but you're free to use whichever IDE you want. So I'm going to open it directly by doing code dot, and this is because I have the code command configured already for my system. But you could essentially go to file, and then you can basically select the folder that we just created and click select folder, and this would do exactly the same thing. Once you have opened into your VS Code, we are going to open the terminal within VS Code so we can see both the terminal and the code within the same window so we don't have to switch back and forth. Once you open this one, I want you to run the command npm install, and this will install all the packages necessary to run this project. Let's go through some of the things that we have here. First of all, in this project, we have some views for error, index, layout. Then we have some routes configured. Then we have a public folder with some images, JavaScript style sheet, or actually the folders of this one. And then we have the bin folder, which is essentially where this all starts. So we are going to look at some of this, and we are also going to clean up the code. So first of all, I want to run npm start within the terminal, and this would basically run node bin www. So it goes ahead and runs this JavaScript, which essentially creates an Express server, and it listens to a particular port called the 3000 port, as you can see here. So what I want to do is to go to my browser, and I'm going to open a new tab, and I'm going to type localhost 3000. And if I do so, you will see that we get this really nice message called Express, welcome to Express. So this is a view that Express.js provides out of the box with this generator that we have used now. So what I want to do is to clean things up. We don't want this view. We just want to create some APIs within this project. So why have all the additional things that we don't really want? So first of all, what I want to do is to go to package.json and see these packages, cookie parser and Jade. Jade is the view engine, so we are going to remove that, and cookie parser is also something that we are not going to use. So I'm going to say npm uninstall cookie parser and then Jade. So this will uninstall both of these dependencies from our project. You can see that they're removed from package.json now. Now what I want to do is to remove the views folder. So let's delete that. We're also going to remove the public folder. We don't need that. And then we are going to adjust some of the things. We are going to remove the users.js as well. Now what I want you to do is to go to bin, and actually I don't really think we need to change anything here. Yeah, we don't. You need to go to app.js, and this is where we are going to make some changes. I'm going to bring this a bit down so we can see more of the code. Now here you can see that we are importing the cookie parser. So we have removed the package. We'll remove this line. We're going to also remove users router because we have removed user.js. So we are going to remove that. We're going to remove both of these lines for the view engine setup. We don't need this one. We are going to remove this cookie parser usage and the static usage as well. So let's remove those. And finally, I'm going to remove this users line from here as well. Now I also want to make sure that we are not using render anywhere. And if I search render, we are going to find some usages here. So the first usage here is in the error. So I'm going to show you what this does. So whenever there is an error, this uses res.render. So instead of that, we can say something like res.send. And here we can say something like something went wrong. And I'm going to show you what that actually means. We also have another usage of renders. That's just a comment. So I'm just going to remove this one. And now let's try to run the application again. I'm going to run npm start again, and this will basically run our server. We don't see any errors, so we are good. Now if I try to go and refresh here, you will see that it says something went wrong. So it sends a message. Instead of sending a message, we would like to send a JSON with the error status and the message. So here I'm going to change this line. So go to app.js again, and where it says res.send something went wrong, just below the res.status, we're essentially going to do something like res.status. Actually, I'm just going to use the same thing here, res.status. I'm going to remove this line, and then we can do JSON, and here we are going to say status, and we can basically do the same thing here. Now instead of doing this 2 times, we can simply do this const status equals error.status or 500, and then we can use it right here and then here as well. And then we can do message, and here we can say error.message, and we can remove the send from here. Now let's save this and then try this out. So if I refresh this right now, it's not going to change anything. It's going to show you the same result. That is because whenever we change our code, we need to stop the server and restart the server, so the server basically gets the new code. Now if I go back and refresh, you see that now we get particular JSON object, we get the status 500, and we can also see no default engine was specified and no extension was provided. So it seems like our project is still using engine somewhere. So let's see where that is. So if I go to index.js, here we are using rest.render index. So we shouldn't be doing that. Instead of this one, we can simply say JSON, and here we can basically provide an object. We can say something like message, and we can say the most famous word, hello world. And here, if I save this, restart my server, and then check it out, let's see if that fixes it. So if I go back and refresh here, you can see that we get the message hello world. So this is a successful API call, and there is our first API call that sends back a message to the client. In this case, our browser is the client. You need to understand that when we put a URL here in the address bar, that basically calls a get method to the endpoint. And when we say this slash, that means localhost 3000 slash. So nothing after localhost 3000. And this is a get call. So this returns back a JSON object. What happens if I try some route that does not exist? So let's say doesn't exist. And if I hit enter here, you will see that the status is 404, the message is not found. So our error handling is working fine. And we can also see that the routes that don't exist return a 404. So that's good. Now we are going to solve one problem, and that is every time I need to change this, I need to restart the server, and that is not really optimal. That slows down the process of development and it's not very productive. So what we are going to do is we are going to install a package called Nodemon, which automatically restarts the server if there's a change in the file system. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my server, and then I'm going to go ahead and install the package. So I'm going to clear this. I'm going to say npm install -- save dev and then Nodemon. This package will be installed, and our package.json will be updated with a new property called dev dependencies. Here you can see this. The difference between dev dependencies and dependencies is that when we deploy our code to production in an optimized way, the dev dependencies are removed. And that is because this Nodemon means that whenever we change a file, then it restarts the server. In production, we are not going to change any files because it should be locked, right? So that's why this is in dev dependencies. Now what we need to do is to change the start script. So if I go to package.json and up here in the script start, it uses node. Instead of that, I'm going to use Nodemon, and that's pretty much it. I'm going to just save this, and I'm going to now run npm start, and this will basically run the Nodemon here, as you can see. And now you can see that we have a bit more CLI messages here, which are reflecting that this process is now watching the paths with JS, MJS, and JSON files. So if I go ahead and just save this, you can see that it restarts the server due to changes. So right now, if I go to my browser and refresh, you can see the message hello world CWA. If I go back to my code, and then if I remove this CWA and hit save, and now if I refresh the browser only, you can see that we get the new message. We did not have to restart the server ourselves, which is really good. Now we are going to create our first API endpoint, and for that we need to restructure our code a bit. In the routes, we are going to create a folder. We are going to call this score, and we are basically going to add scores, receive scores, and whatnot. In this folder, I'm going to create 3 files, score.controller.js, and similarly, we are going to have another file called score.service.js. And inside here, we are also going to have score.model.js. Now you could also name this one score.route.js, but it's totally up to you on what you decide to do. Now what I will do is I will basically copy the code from index.js and paste inside score controller, and I'm also going to bring this down. So here, if I paste this code, you notice that first of all, we import the Express code or Express package, then we create a router out of it, and then we have these API implementations like router.get, or basically defining the routes, and then finally we export the router from here, right? And I'm going to remove this comment. This doesn't make sense. Now that we have this, we are going to import this code inside index.js. So what I want to do now is to change the index.js a bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of this from here, and I'm going to basically say module.exports is supposed to be a function which takes the app, and then we are going to import the router and then use them. So I'm going to say something like import, or actually not here, but I'm going to import score router. So we are going to say score router equals, and here we are going to say require score slash, and we are going to say score.controller. Now this is the score router that we want to use. So here we're going to say app.use score and then score score router. So we are basically going to pass the app from the app.js, and then we are registering this score router at /score. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go to my app.js, and where I'm importing the index router like this, all I need to do is just to say routes, and here we are importing routes.index here, and then I just need to go ahead here and say something like routes, and here I need to pass the app. Once I do this, this app will be passed into the routes, and then we are using app.use here to basically call and register this router. And then I need to go to my app.js here and basically remove anything that is not being used. For example, here you can see that we have routes index that we have imported, but we are not using path. So I'm going to also change var to const because we are not really using or reassigning these variables anywhere. Now that this looks good, let's try this out and see if our route has changed to /score. And when we say /score, that means localhost 3000 /score. Now I'm going to go to my controller, and you see it here. So this would become http localhost 3000 and then /score. And this is the route that we are talking about here. So I'm going to save this now. And here we're getting some errors. So let's have a quick look. So it says app.use index router in the app.js, which is here. So we need to remove this line from here because now we are using routes app here. So we are going to save this now. We don't have any errors anymore. I'm going to bring this bit down. And now if we try to refresh here, you will see that this is a 404 because now there is no route at /. Although our route has changed to /score. And if I do this, you see that we get the message hello world. Now we are going to implement the API endpoints. So for that, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to go to controller and define all the routes here. So have a look at the API design that we are talking about here. This is the REST API convention that we are following. So our base URL is http localhost 3000. And then the score URL or the score API stands at /score. Now you will notice that we have one get call. This call is to get all the scores based on a game ID. So in the end of this URL, we need to provide the game ID. The post call is going to be used for adding a new record in the database for a particular person. So we are going to provide the game ID, user ID, and the score via post body, and that would not be included in the URL. So we don't need the game ID here because we are passing everything in the body. You're going to look at that when we go there. Then we have a put call. This will be used for updating the score within the database. So an existing record using the game ID and the user ID will be used for updating this. Then we got the delete call, and here we are just going to delete a particular record by providing the game ID and the user ID. And that's pretty much it. Now let's design this API in the code base. So first of all, we have this one, which is essentially get scores by game ID. And then we are going to essentially use this route for this one. Then we are going to go ahead and create router.post. And in this one, we are going to provide / here. And then we are going to essentially leave it as it is. Now for the first one, we decided that we are going to provide the game ID here as a parameter. And we provide the parameter as something like this. We say colon game ID, and that's pretty much it. For the post one, we don't need this parameter, so we are going to keep this as it is. I'm also going to convert this into an arrow function just to follow the ES6 convention. And here I'm going to just replace this. So in this particular case, when we do a post, we are going to create a new object. So we are going to put a comment here, add a new score for this one. And then we also would have something like this. So we would have update an existing record. So an existing score. And in this particular case, we are going to use the put call. And then finally, we'll have a delete call here as well. So the delete call would be just like this. I mentioned that for the put, we are going to have the game ID, and also for the delete one, we are going to have the game ID as well. I'm going to just remove this for now or comment this for now to show you something. Here, we are going to change the messages. So let's say this one is get scores. This one is, for example, add score. And in this one, we are going to say update score. And this one would be called delete score. Notice that right now we are using hard-coded data just to see if these API calls work. Now that we have this, let's try this out. So I'm going to go back to my browser, and if I hit refresh, this is not going to work because /score does not exist with a get method. What exists in the code is for the get method, we should provide the game ID after the /score. So if I go ahead and basically say something like game 123 and hit enter, now you will see that we get the get scores. Now, we can test the get call by browser, but we cannot test the other calls via this address bar, as you can see. So we need a REST client for this one. And I already shared with you that we have this Rapid API builder, which contains this REST API client. And this is amazing because we can create the calls right here. So what we are going to do first is we are going to create environments. We would have a local environment and a production environment. So let's go and click here, then click manage. And here we are going to call add environment group. Now this one would be called, we are going to rename this and call local. Then we are going to add another just like this. So click on the group and then add environment. And then we are going to call this one production. Then we are going to create our first variable. We are going to call this base URL. And then we are going to provide the value HTTP localhost 3000. And we are going to use the same for production just for the safe side. Now that we have this, we are going to create our first request. So click this plus button and then we are going to name this request from the description. So go to description and call it get scores by game ID. And then you can provide a description here. I'm just going to leave it for now. Now you are supposed to provide here the URL. If we want to use a variable from our environments, we are supposed to press starting curly brace and then you need to click environment variable. Then you need to click environment variable and click base URL. And then you can say slash score slash game 123. Now this is the entire URL. This base URL itself is localhost 3000 as you can see. And then we have slash score slash game ID. Here at the bottom, what I love about Rapid API builder and this REST client is that it shows you the code to use. You can just copy paste this code into project and you should be able to just hit this API call from your front end code. You can see we have fetch, we have Axios code, we have HTTP in Node.js, we have Axios in JavaScript example. So there are a lot of examples that you could put. Also, I think we have for Swift and also for Ruby and whatnot. So you can basically just copy paste and get this running. Now the fun part is that what would happen if I click this send button? Would it work? You can pause this video and think for a couple of seconds why this would not work. And when you resume, I can tell you quickly that this would not work because this whole builder right now lives on the internet. My server is on localhost or on my machine. My server is not exposed to the internet, so that builder cannot access my machine or my server. So if I hit send here, you will see 403 forbidden, some error code here, and this is because it cannot access my server. So how do we make this possible for this REST API client to connect to our local server? We need to expose our server somehow. For this, we are going to use a package called ngrok, and you can basically search ngrok npm, go to the documentation, and there you should be able to find how to use it. So if you go here, you will see that you need to install the package and then you can run this global command. What I would tell you is that you can basically go to your terminal and then create a new one, and then you can basically run npx. So you do npx ngrok http 3000. We are exposing 3000 port and we are using ngrok and we are using the HTTP protocol. So when we hit enter, this would essentially give us a URL that we can copy. So here you can see now that we got this URL and you can basically copy this URL. You need to make sure that this process is running, the ngrok process, and this terminal is not closed or terminated. Otherwise the server or this tunneling would stop. So you can just copy this one just like this, and then you need to go to REST client, and in here we can now go ahead and just go to our environment, manage, and here for the local base URL we can replace this with the ngrok URL. Make sure that there's no slash at the end because we add the slash afterwards in here in our address bar or in our client. Now that we have this, let's try this out. So if I hit the send button now, you can see that we got the 200 OK. Woohoo! And if I see the JSON text here, you can see that it says message get scores. So this REST API client, which is on the internet, can now access our local server, which is amazing. Now we are going to essentially create some other records as well, but I want to basically return a data that looks like the real world example. So I'm going to go to my code here and then I'm going to change the data. Now one really important thing to understand is that when we created these three files, we want to separate the concerns. We want to have the routes in one file. We want to have the functions or the place where it connects to the database or does anything with the data into a separate file. And this is the score service. That's going to be the file that we are talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into score service and create a function. So we can say const get scores, and here we are providing the game ID because that's what it needs, just the game ID. And then we are going to basically return a hard-coded data at the moment. So we are going to have something like game ID. We are going to say game 123. We are going to say user ID. This is going to be user 123, and then it's going to be a score. So the score, let's say we have 100. So this is an array of two objects that I'm going to just use right now. just like this. We're going to change the username. So we say something like 456 and the score, for example, is 89. Now I want to expose this function from this file so it can be used in the controller. So at the very end, I'm going to say something like module.exports, and here we are going to say get score. So we are basically exposing this object that can be used there. So I'm going to go to my controller now, and here instead of just doing res.json, first we are going to get the scores. So we are going to say const scores equals, and then we are going to basically say get scores. As you can see, this is importing from the score service, and then that's what we need. So we are going to pass the game ID. Now to get the game ID from the parameters, you need to do something like this. You need to do const game ID equals req.params, and this will basically get out the game ID for us, and then we'll pass it into the get scores. The get scores function does not use game ID now, but it will in the future. So now what we need to do is just to return these scores in the data property. So we are going to make sure that all of our responses have this sort of data contract, which means it's going to have an object, it's going to have the data property, and the relevant data would be inside there. So I'm going to just save this now and try this out. So if I go back to my REST API client and hit send, now you will see that we get this object which contains the data property, and it has an array which contains 2 hard-coded scores. This is perfect because now we can know what kind of data the front-end application, whether it's a mobile application or a web application or a REST client, would receive from our backend. This is amazing. Now what I want to do is to add the post call so we can also test it out. So I'm going to duplicate this call from here. We're going to go to the description and rename this to add score. In this one, we are going to make it a post call. Always make sure to check it from the code. What is the definition of this post call? Notice that it does not have this game ID parameter. So we're going to go to our REST client and remove this game ID from here. Otherwise this will not work. For example, if I try this API call now, it will basically say 404 not found. This does not exist. But if I remove this and if I hit send, now this is a 200 because this URL exists, and we return back the hard-coded data at score. Instead of using this, what we would want to do is whatever we pass as the body in this post call is returned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this code from here and then paste it inside body JSON. So you need to paste it here. Now, one really important thing to understand here is that when we are creating a new score, we need to provide all these 3 things, and we are just going to return this back as a hard-coded response for now. So right now, if I hit send, it would still show this hard-coded data. So we need to code something to return this body back. So I'm going to go to my code, and then first I'm going to extract out the body from here. So I can go and say const here. We are going to essentially say game ID, user ID, and then the score, and then we are extracting it out from the request body. This is important. Then we are going to pass this to a function. That function does not exist yet. So I'm going to go ahead into the service file, and then I'm going to say const, and here we are going to say add score, and then this would retrieve the game ID, the user ID, and the score. And then all I need to do is just to return the same thing. So I'm going to basically do this. Now what I'm going to do is actually not do this, but remove this. So we are returning whatever we receive as a parameter. So the same game ID, same user ID, same score is going to be returned. And then I need to basically expose this function for usage. So I'm going to do this. And now I'm going to go to my controller, and in here, I'm going to use something like const new score, or we can call it saved score, equals to add score. And then in the add score, we are basically passing game ID, user ID, and score. This add score needs to be imported from score service. So add score should be imported. And then we need to just return the saved score in the data property. As I mentioned, we need to have a constant or consistent data contract. Now let's save this and try this out. So I'm going to go to my REST client and hit send for the post call. And you can see now we get the data, we get the same object back, whatever we are passing from here, which means that we are able to extract out the body from post and utilize it. If I change this to 89 and hit send, you can see that we get back 89. So whatever we pass from here is going to be returned back to us. Now let's go ahead and create the rest of the APIs, which is the update API and the delete API. So I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to update the description. I'm going to say update score. In this one, this is going to be a put call. and this requires a game ID. So I'm going to hard code it right now, calling game123. And then in the body, we need to only have user ID and score. Why? Because the game ID is already provided in the parameter. So I can remove this from here, just pretty print it and try it out. So if I hit stand now, you can see that we get the JSON text with the hard coded data update score. So let's fix that. First of all, I'm going to go to my service and create a function just like this. So I'm going to go ahead and do something like update score. This will again receive game ID, user ID and score. and it will return the same hard-coded data back. I'm going to expose this, and then in the controller, I'm going to change the put call to be similar to what we have in the post. So I'm going to just replace this, but remember, we have the game ID already in the parameter, so it's not going to be extracted from request body. So I'm going to remove game ID from here and extract it from params. So I'm going to say game ID, actually something like this. So it would be game ID equals request.params. And then we are passing the game ID user ID score to the update score method, just like this. Make sure that you're importing this from the service, and that should be it. So if I hit save now, and I'm also going to call it updated score rather than saved score, just for good readability. So I'm going to save this and try this out from the REST client. If I hit send now, you should be able to see the game ID, the user ID, and the score. If I change the user ID to 45, hit send, you can see that we received the relevant data. And if I change the game ID, we also see the game ID and the user ID being reflected. So I'm going to kind of reverse this for later usage. And now let's implement the delete call. So I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to description and say something like delete score. And then this is going to be of type delete. And then we have the game ID here. But in this particular call, we don't really need any body. So I'm going to remove this. This should not send any body at all. And now if I try to send it, you can see that we see a not found. That is interesting because this should be there. So if I go to my code and if I show you, we actually commented it out. So that's why we are receiving this 404. So I'm going to uncomment this now and try this out. So if I hit now, you can see that we get the message delete score. Now let's update it to reflect or send back whatever object we got. We just send it back just like we did in the put. So I'm going to basically get all of this or copy all of this. We don't have the body in this one, so we only have game ID. And then what we need to do, or actually we should have a body in this one, because when we are deleting a record, we don't only need the game ID, but also the user ID, because we are going to remove the score of one particular person. Otherwise, it will just remove the score for everybody in the game. So it does require a body in this case, and we are supposed to pass the user ID and the game ID into a function. So I'm going to go back into delete and bring back the JSON here, which was basically this user ID. So here we can say user ID, and here we can say user 123, just to keep it here. Then I'm going to go and create a function. So just like updated score, I'm going to go ahead and say something like delete score, and then I'm going to expose this function from here. And then we are going to just receive these two things and return these two things. We don't get score, so we don't return score. Now I'm going to go to my controller, and instead of update score, we say delete score, and then we basically say deleted score here, and then we basically return this back. So I'm going to save this now and try this out. So in the client, if I hit send now, you can see that we get the game ID, we get the user ID, and we return that back. We can double check this by updating it, and you can see this updates here. And if I do this, it also updates here as well. So we are good with testing this out. And this is great. Now we have all the calls in front of us that we can test out after changing our code. So this will really boost the rapid development. And it's funny because we are using Rapid API. How cool. Now that we have these APIs, I want to bring one important part. What happens if I want to delete a score and I don't provide an object at all? What would happen? It would still return back the game ID. The 200 OK still is the status, which means that everything went good. But it would not be good because it could be a disaster if we don't provide the user ID. It could have deleted the entire set of records for the particular game ID. So we need to make sure somehow that body that we are providing in these requests are actually there. And just not the body, but also let's say parameters are also there. So we need to somehow validate all of that. So how do we go about that? We are going to use a package that is called JOI, which is a validation package based on schema. So with the JOI package, you can basically define that, hey, this is the schema that we are expecting, and you can test an object against that schema. And this is really interesting because you can definitely check that, hey, do we have an object that contains a username and password, and is it required or not? So for the case of our use case, for example, if we go for this delete score, we can define a schema that says the user ID should be of a type string, and it also should be required, so we cannot miss it. So let's include this package and test it out. So I'm going to quickly go to my code here, and then I'm going to go to a new terminal. The first terminal that I'm using is serving the server. The second one is running ngrok. So I need a third one. So I'm going to just add this, and then I'm going to use npm install JOI. And this will be installed as not a dev dependency, but a dependency, because this needs to go to production. So now that we have this package installed, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, we want to create a middleware that we can easily use for validating request.body and in fact request.parameters for all of these calls. This is really important. Now that we have this package installed, let's go and do a few things. First of all, what I want you to do is to create a new folder. We are going to call this validators. Inside here, we are going to create a new file. We are going to call it score.validators.js. And here we are going to paste some code. What I want you to do is to look in the description of this video and you'll find the link to this gist. And this gist contains the entire code for the validation. So you need to copy this code, then go back to VS Code and then paste it. I'm going to bring this down and show you what this does. So on line number 1, we are basically importing or requiring the JOI. Then we import the HTTP errors function, and then we create some DTOs. The DTO means data transfer object, and this is essentially the schema of what we should expect in the body or in request.body for each of the cases. We have one for add score, we have for delete score, and for update score. For the add score, you can see that we are expecting an object which should contain the keys, game ID, which should be a string, it should be required, the user ID is type string and it is required, then the score is number and is required, which means that we cannot accept or have a payload which has even one of these properties missing. For delete score, we are essentially looking at user ID, and for update score, we are looking at user ID and score. Now you might be thinking, why are we not checking the param? Why are we only checking the bodies? Because the param itself is part of the URL. So if this is missing, the URL would be different and it would return a 404 in that case. So we are 100% sure when this function gets triggered that we are actually hitting the right URL, which has the game ID in case of put and also in case of delete. So all we need to just validate is the body. Now let's go back to the validators files and see the code further. So after creating these data transfer objects, what I have is a function. This function is the middleware function that we are going to use with our controllers or with our route definitions. What this accepts is a validator. So it would be either of these validators, the add score, delete score, or update score. And essentially it would validate using the validate async method and will validate the request.body. So it will get the request, validate the request.body, and after validation, if everything looks good, then we basically assign the validated body to request.body and pass it further in the process. So when this next function will be called, for example, if we are talking about the add score, then the next function would essentially trigger this function. So now the request body would contain everything that we should have. That is the power of validators. If there's an error or if this validator does not validate itself or doesn't return a success, then it automatically throws an error, and we can check here if the error is of JOI, and if that's the case, then we create this HTTP error and then we basically send the message back. We're going to look at that in just a bit. If the error is something else, then we essentially just go forward in the process with the error of 500. Finally, we export all of these things. We export the DTO objects and we export the validator as well. So now we are going to first try out our add score validator in the route. So I'm going to go to my controller, and in here with the post call, I'm going to call this validator or this middleware. So we are calling this score DTO validator. I'm going to actually name it just like this because this is a function and it should start from small case. So I'm going to save this now, and now we are going to go to the controller, and in this case we are going to type score DTO validator, and you can notice that I'm just putting this whole execution just before the function. The router.post takes the URL or the path as the first parameter, and the second parameter is the function call, but we are providing another function in between which is also essentially a function call which acts as a middleware. So we can pass as many functions as we want in this whole sequence, but this one is a function and we need to provide add score DTO here, which is the validator. Now when we call this function, what happens is that it goes inside this function, which is essentially a closure function with the validator, and then when the route gets hit, it calls this nested function which is being returned from here, and the nested function contains request, response, next, just like the function that we have here. So it's the same pattern, it's the same structure of the code. Now when we get this, we basically validate this, we assign the request body, and what I explained, it just does that. Now I'm going to save this file, and we are going to make sure that we are importing score DTO validator and the add score DTO as we have done here, and now we can test this out. So I'm going to go back to my REST API client, and in the add score here, I'm going to make another call. If I hit send here, you can see that we still get 200, we still get the data back. But what would happen if I remove the score from here? If I hit send now, you can see that it says 422 unprocessable entity, and here you can see the message score is required. Now this is great because our front end, whether it's a web application, mobile application, or even just a REST API client, it knows what data it is missing. Similarly, it just doesn't tell what is missing, but also if the data type is incorrect, it would also fix it. For example, here, if I start saying true here and hit send, you will see that it says score must be a number. So it cannot be a boolean in this case. So it validates that this is required and also validates the type. Because if I go back to my code into the validators, you will notice that the add score DTO has score defined as a number and as required. So we cannot have this missing and we should have this as a number. The one interesting thing is that if we say this is 100, which is a number, but rather in a string, what would happen in this case? If I send this call, you will notice that it passes with 200. And that is because this JOI library basically smartly converts this 100 into a number because it can be converted into a number. And the proof of that is that we are returning a number value here, although we are passing a string value from the payload. Now, if I change this to something that cannot be converted into a number smartly, then it would start crying and it would say that this should be a number. And this is really nice feature. For example, if you forget to pass this as a number or don't pass this as a number, but rather a string that can be converted into a number, then it would do it automatically for you. So this is great. Now that we have this, let's update the other two APIs to have this validator testing as well. So I'm going to go to my code, and inside here, I'm going to go to controller, and in here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start with the update one. So here we can say score DTO validator, and here we can say update score DTO, and here just putting a comma here. And similarly, I'm going to go here and paste score DTO validator, and here we are going to say delete score DTO, and this should make everything work. Let's test it. So I'm going to go to my update score now and test a normal call. Looks good. If I remove the score, hit send, you can see it says score is required. If I remove the user ID, it would then say user ID is required, and the other validations would work as well. Let's quickly see delete score. So in here, we are only passing the user ID. If I hit send, everything works. If I remove the user ID in this case, then it should say user ID is required. Cool. So now we have all the API calls having validations, and these validations trigger at the time of the API call, not before we try to see what data to return or even connecting with the database. So this is good. Now the next step is very interesting. We are going to connect to a database where we will store these values and retrieve these values as well. Right now we are just using the hard-coded data from our code base, but now we are going to work with real database. So what I want you to do is go to cloud.mongodb.com, and you need to log in using your account. I'm right now using my Google account to log into this. Once you do so, you're going to click this create button, and you're supposed to create a cluster here. You need to select shared because dedicated one is not free. So you could use shared at this moment, and then you can select AWS, and then you can select the cloud provider and region. And you can see that this is an M0 sandbox, which we are using right now. Once you've selected all of this, just create the cluster via clicking this button. Then you need to click browse collections, and inside here, we are going to create a database. So you need to click create database and then name it Scorer Pro. So Scorer-Pro, and then you can name the collection. Now we are going to use a package called Mongoose, which is sort of an ORM that we will use for connecting with this database. And the way it works is that it basically names the collection as plural. So if we are saving a score, we are going to have to name the collection scores. So I'm going to name this scores, and I'm going to just click create in this one. And now you can see that our Scorer Pro database is here, and I can click scores, and in scores, we don't have any documents. As you can see, the result here is 0. Now that we have this, let's have a look at Mongoose. So I'm going to go to Mongoose documentation, or you can search Mongoose npm. Then you can see that this is mongoosejs.com. So I'm going to go to get started because that's how we work. First of all, we need to install this package via npm install. So I'm going to do that. So go to your terminal and then make sure that we are not touching either the server or the ngrok in this case, and have a new terminal where we can say npm install mongoose save. I'm going to go back to the documentation, and in here, I'm going to copy this code for the getting started portion. From here, I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to go back to my code. And in here, we are going to create a new file. You can see that the Mongoose package installation is successful here. So I'm just going to clear this. I'm going to bring this down. And now we are going to create a new file. We are going to call this db.js, and then we are going to paste this code here. Notice that we are requiring Mongoose on the first line. Then we're calling this async function called main in case we are not able to connect with the MongoDB database. But in case we connect, then I would just console log here something like MongoDB connected, and that's pretty much it. So we get a notification or sort of a representation that our DB connection works fine. Now that we have this, we need to call this file, or we need to basically import this file into app, because right now this file just exists within our project but is not linked. The process that follows for this server is when we run the npm start command, it runs Nodemon. It goes inside the www folder, or actually the bin folder, and the www file, and inside here you will notice that at the very top it imports the app file, and in here when it imports the app file, all of the code of the app is triggered. So now what we need to do is to import the db file inside the app file so the db file's code can be executed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just require the db file here. So I can simply say require, and here we can say /db, and when we do so, the db.js code would automatically be executed, which means this line would be executed automatically. Now one thing that I just saw is that in here we are using a lot of var, so we are going to replace those with const because we are not really reassigning those anywhere, so it's good to use const in that case. So I'm going to replace all of these instances, and now let's see if our server is working fine. Here you can see that our server says MongoDB connected because our database is connected. However, the database that has been connected is on localhost, and we don't want to connect with localhost. We rather want to connect with the cloud MongoDB. That's what we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually stop the server from here, and then I'm going to go to my cloud MongoDB. From your cloud MongoDB, you need to create a user, a database access user. You can click the add new database user. You can use the password option here and then just create a user according to your liking. Once you're done with that, you need to see the username and also remember the password. Then you will go into your databases, and here you're going to go to browse collections and in command line tools here. And once you go here, you're going to go to connect instructions and connect your application. Then you need to copy all of this. Now I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go to my code and I'm going to just hard code it here just like this. So I'm going to just paste it here. Now what you need to understand is that we have this username colon and then password. You need to remove these angle brackets around the password and just paste your password. For example, if it's db1234, then that is what it will be. Then at the end of the URL, you will notice that you have a slash and then a question mark. Just before the question mark, you need to put the name of the database so it connects directly with the Scorer Pro database. So you need to say Scorer-Pro and this will connect with the database. Now all I need to do is just replace this password with my actual password. So I'm going to do that, and you can also replace this with your actual password. Okay, so I'm just going to replace this, and now let's see if this works. So I'm going to say npm start, and now you can see that we got MongoDB connected. What would happen if I messed up with this password? For example, if in the end I say 123 and hit save here, you will notice that now it says error, and here you can say bad auth because the authentication failed for this particular user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back and save, and you can see that now it says MongoDB connected. So our database is connected with our application, and this is super cool. So I'm going to bring this down now that our connection is working. One more thing that we could do is instead of hard coding this data here, because when we will publish this to production, or if I decide to push this code to GitHub, we don't really want our code to contain passwords because that's a really bad practice. We shouldn't be pushing that to any of the repositories. So what are we going to do about this? We're going to create an env file that would live into my machine and will never be pushed to GitHub, and that would contain the value of this. So we are going to create a new file here. We are going to call it .env because this is an environment file. Then we are going to say mongo_db_url equals, and in quotation we are going to paste all all this string. So I'm going to just copy this and then I'm going to go to env and paste this entire string. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my db.js, and instead of this string, we are going to write process.env dot the variable name. So we can say process.env dot, and here we can say mongo underscore db underscore url. Now this is going to retrieve the value of this variable from the env file just like this. But for this, we need a package, and this package is called .env. So if you go to npm again and search .env, you will find the package and you can see the documentation from it. But essentially what we just need to do is to install this package just like this. So I'm going to go to my terminal and I'm going to go and just say npm install .env-save. After this is installed, you can see in the instructions that we need to create the env file, which we already did, and define our variables. Then as soon as possible, we need to require this into our file, and that is what we are going to do. So we are going to just copy this, go back to our code, and you know that the starting point of our application is this www. So at the very top, even before this app, we can do require.env.config, and this would essentially make sure that our variables are available. Now if you go to the terminal where your server is running, you can see that we have some errors here. So I'm going to save this, and once we do so, we can restart the server so the env file is imported. Now you can see that the MongoDB connected because our application via this code was able to retrieve the env variables, and this db.js was then able to process it and connect via the MongoDB string. So now we can bring this down as our DB is connected via the env file, and we need to make sure that we never commit this to GitHub. So far we have not worked with anything related to Git, but when it comes to the point, we are going to do it. So just hold your horses. Now what I want to do is just focus on the MongoDB part where we are able to add, retrieve, update and delete score records directly in the database. We're going to start with the add call. So in this case, I'm going to go to routes score and inside score controller, and in here we are going to make a couple of changes. So first of all, we need to use this score.model.js to define the schema of the score entity. Score is an entity that is going to be saved into the database, and Mongoose basically helps us define a schema so we can basically know what properties are going to be saved in the database. So no one can just put different properties and weird kind of structure of this data and just save to the database. Mongoose will make sure that it only has the properties that we define as the schema. So let's see how we can define a schema in Mongoose. So for this, you can go back to the Mongoose documentation and go to schemas from the left menu, and in here you have an example. So I'm going to just copy this example from here, go to the code into score model.js, and I'll just replace the initial statement with const mongoose equals require mongoose just for consistency. Otherwise we would have to change everything to import. So let's just use this require statement. Then you can see that we extract out schema from mongoose, and then we define the schema using this schema constructor. We are going to rename this to score schema in this case, and we know that we are going to have a couple of things. First, we are going to have user ID, which is going to be type string. Then we are going to have game ID, which is going to be of type string, and we'll have a score, which is going to have the value or the type as number. Now that we have this, we can remove the rest of the things because we don't really want them. In the end, what we want to do is to create a model out of it. So we can say score equals to mongoose.model, and here we are essentially saying score with the score schema, and that is how you define a model. The schema is how it would look, or the definition of the entities that would be saved. The model itself is something that we'll use for calling the functions. We could say score.add or score.save. We could say score.findOne, score.update, stuff like that. And finally, we are going to just export this score from here. So we can say module.exports, and here we can say score. So we can use this model directly into further our code. Now that we have done this, we are going to quickly go to controller and we are going to modify it. But even before so, we need to go to service and then update the add score method. First of all, what I want you to understand is that we need to create a new score and save it to the database. The way to do that is to do something like const new score equals, and here we can say new, and we are using the score model here as a constructor. So we can say score, and this score is supposed to be imported from the file that we just mentioned. So I'm going to go to model and make sure that we are exporting this. Yes, we are. And then in the service, we can basically say score. And then here we can pass all of these three things. So we are going to pass game ID, user ID, and score. Now I also need to import this. So I'm going to import this. So at the very top, I'm going to say something like const score equals to, and here we can say require, and we can say something like this. We can say score.model, and we are having the score now. Once we have done this, we can also make sure to do something like this. We can say new score.save, and this will essentially save this to the database. Now, finally, what we need to do is to return the value. Now we need to make this function async because this statement here is essentially a promise. So we need to do something like return await new score.save, and that is essentially what's going to save this to the database. Now that we have this function as async, we need to fix our controller function to also be async. So I'm gonna go ahead and update the post function, which is this one, and here I'm gonna say this is async. Now what I need to do is to update this to use this promise notation. So here add score that we are using now is async, so this returns a promise. So this would then have await. So this is an async function using an await statement that returns back the save score, and here we get it. Now that we have this, we are going to wrap this into a try catch just to make sure that when something fails, we are able to capture that error and also save that. So I'm going to save this and go back to my REST API client, and in here I'm going to go to add score, and we are passing game123, user123, and 100 as the score. If I hit send, you will notice that we get 200, but this time something special. We get this ID and version as well in this scenario, and that is because this data has now been saved into MongoDB. This ID was generated by MongoDB, and we get it back as a response. What would be a better way to verify this other than going to the database and checking it out? So I'm going to go to my database again, and here into collections, and inside the Scorer Pro scores, and in scores we can see that here we go, we have our first record in the MongoDB database. Yay! Now let's go back to our Scorer Pro here, and here we are going to do a couple of things. Now let's go back to the REST API client and discuss one thing. Should it be possible for someone to add another record with the same game ID and same user ID? Should that be possible? If I do it right now, you can see that we get 200 and this, which means that if I refresh on my cloud MongoDB, we will have two records of the same user and of the same game. Now this shouldn't have been possible, and that is because we can only have one record for one game ID plus one user ID because we don't want duplicate. So I'm going to delete this one for now, and let me try to explain how we can make sure that our database, when adding a new record, stops this process and says, hey, this is a duplicate error. In order to do so, what we need to do is to create an index, a compound index based on user ID and game ID that defines this rule that there can be only one record in this scores collection that has the same user ID and game ID. So there cannot be two records with the same user ID and game ID. So what we will do here is we are going to go to our code, and in the model here, and here we are going to define on the schema what this index is. So we can say something like score schema dot index, and this is a method that takes an object. We need to define user ID as 1, game ID as 1, because we are selecting these two properties, and then we are saying unique true. So this creates a compound index with this combination being a unique one. So now that we have saved this and our server is restarting, let's try adding the same data again. So I'm going to go back to my REST API client and know that our database right now only has one record. If I try to do this again and hit send, what would happen? Our server will crash, and that is because you can see it says ngrok gateway error, so invalid HTTP response, but I know what happened. If I go back to my code, and here you can see that the app crashed and now it's waiting for the changes. If we go up and see what was the reason, you can see it says duplicate key error, and here you can see that it has a duplicate key including user ID and game ID because we are trying to add the same record within the database. Even if the score is different, if we have the same game ID and same user ID as an existing record, this should fail. But the question is, should our server crash? Because now it cannot really work. If I go back to my client here, and if I hit send here, you will see that it shouldn't work. For somehow the REST API client makes it look like this works. But if I go to localhost 3000 and hit refresh, you will see that the response would not get back because the server itself is down. So our server has crashed. What we should do about it is to handle the errors gracefully. So in our route, when we get an error, we should handle it in a proper manner. So what we can do is we can wrap this whole execution of the add new score in the route controller to try catch. So I can simply say try, and in this case, I'm going to put everything inside this try block. Then when we catch an error here, we just need to pass this error into next or the next method. So that's all that we want to do. Now, if we save this, the server would restart, MongoDB is connected. And if I go and try to add the same data again, this time we will get 500 internal server error. We get a status and a message that says duplicate key, blah, 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 but our server does not crash. If I go to localhost 3000, refresh, you can see that we get the data. So our server doesn't crash. If I go back to my server's console here, you can see that there was a 500 error, but the server did not crash. And then we just did a get call, and that also resulted in a write status. So having said that, you can see that we are now not able to add duplicate records. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to add a few more records. For the add score, let's say the game is still the same. The user is 123444. And if I send, this should be successful because the user this time is different. Or we could do something like user1 and hit enter. And here you can see that we got another record in the database. Now let's talk about the get call. The get call should return all the records based on a particular game ID in this case. So we are going to go to our code and going to go to controller. And in this case, we are calling the get scores method. So we are going to go to get scores and we're going to update it. We're going to make this an async function just like this one. So we can say something like return await score.find game ID. And we can make this a one-liner. So I'm going to remove this. I'm going to remove this return as well and the end bracket as well, which is this one. And this is a one-liner now. So all we do is essentially just returning all the scores based on this game ID. The find method takes an object, and in the property, whatever value you provide, it will basically return all the elements based on that criteria or based on that query. Now let's try this out in the client. So I'm going to go to get score by game ID and hit send. And here you see that we get nothing. And that is because we forgot one more step. We need to go to our controller, make this function an async function, and then put an await here because this get score is an async function. It returns back a promise. So we need to handle it accordingly. Now that we have this, let's try this out again. We're going to go and hit send. And this time you can see that we get all of the data. We get all three records that you can see here with their IDs, with their data accordingly. And this is good. We can add more scores, and every time we do so in the get call, we'll get all of the scores back. This is good. Now let's talk about update call. So I'm going to go to my code and see the put call here. And in the put call, you can see that we get the params, body, and then we call update score. So first, let's make this function an async function just like this. And then what we are going to do is go to update score. In here, we are going to say async. And in here, we are going to say return await score dot find one and update. GitHub Copilot, thank you so much. And here you can see that we get this data back. Now, we could also make this one-liner, but I'm going to keep it as it is for now, just for code readability. So just do something like this. And I want to show you something actually. In this situation, you will see that the first parameter that we have is the criteria of finding. In this case, we are using this find one and update with this query. So we are finding one element that has this game ID, this user ID, and the data we are updating is the score. So we can always update the score based on the game ID and user ID of the one particular record that we can find. This third object or this third parameter where we are saying new true, this is interesting. Let me show you what this is. So I'm going to first remove this, save this, make sure that our put call has this async function. We use the await here because that's important. And then we also need to put try catch around this just like we did for post. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually wrap all of this into a try block. And then I'm going to say catch here. The catch error would essentially just go ahead and say next error. And then I'm going to just update this one and hit save. And now let's see what happens. So first, if I go and update the score, I need a particular game ID that we already have. Then we also need a user ID. So let's say we have this user 12344 and we want to change the score from 100 to 50. So I'm going to go to update score and here change the user ID, and here we are going to say 50. If I hit send here, let's see what happens. If I hit send, you can see that we get 200, okay, but the score that we get is still 100. That's pretty weird. Why is that so? Let's try to change it to 30. If I hit send now, you will notice that we get 50. What? Didn't I just update 50 the previous time, and now I'm trying to do 30 and it sends me back 50. That's weird. And that is because by default, when we call this method, the find one and update, what it returns is the old copy of the data before it was updated. And to return the new copy, you need to provide this new true, or this object with the property new true. And once we do so, our problems should be solved. So I'm going to go ahead and try this out now. Let's try this to be 120 now. If I hit send now, you see that we get 120 right away. The data that we are updating is being reflected right away, and this is what we wanted. Now let's try to update a record which does not exist. So I'm going to say user or US here, and if I hit send, what would happen? If I do this, you will see that we still got 200, but the data is null. Now, this is weird, right? Because we shouldn't be getting a 200 if what we intended did not happen. We intended to update a record and it says this was successful. Now this is weird. So what we will need to do is to make sure that there was something updated. And when we get null in this case, we are going to say 404, because this null means there was not any element that we found and could update. So we are going to go to our code and make sure that happens. So in this score.controller.js, right after we have this updated score, we need to check if it was null or not. So we can check if updated score or updated score equals to null, and you need to make sure that we are not confusing updated score with updated score, because there's only one letter difference. So this needs to be updated score, not update score. If that's the case, then what we want to do is to do this. We need to do res.status 404 and JSON score not found. And since we have this habit of returning the error, so here we are going to check if the updated score is null, and you have to make sure that you're using updated score and not update score, because they both are very similar, and if you miss it, you're not going to get the same result. So you need to do res.status 404.json score not found, and we also need to just return it so it doesn't go to this particular statement. Now we are going to save this and try this out. So if I go back to my REST API client and if I try this call again with a user that does not exist and hit send, you can see that it says 404 and says error score not found. Now this is good, and I can now see a user that exists, and if I hit update here, in this case you can see that we get the result that we wanted. Finally, we need to implement the delete score call so it deletes the data from the database. In this case, we are going to go into our code base here, and then we are going to go to the service method, and here we have delete score. So all we need to do here is to do something like return score dot find one and delete, and in here we're going to provide the game ID, and then we are going to essentially just do this. So we are going to remove this, and this also can be a one-liner. So maybe we can just make this async here and then do await here in this case. And then we are going to essentially just go ahead, or actually we don't really need to make this async in that case, or anyone in this case, because we are using async there. So maybe we can remove this, do just like this, because we are going to have the async on the other side and we are not processing anything here. So I'm going to just remove async from here as well. And then we are going to make the same thing here, the delete score here, and we just need to return this calculation from here. Now that we have this, we need to go to our controller. And in the controller where it says delete, we are going to do the same thing as here. We're going to use try catch, and we are also going to make sure that this function is an async function. In here, we are going to wrap all of this inside a try block, just like this. And then we are going to have a catch here, and then we are simply going to do next error, and then in the try one we are going to paste this. Now we also need to make sure that there was some data that was deleted. So how do we check that? If I go to my REST API client now, first let's make sure that everything works. So the get call here works. If I add a new score, let's say with a user 122 and hit send, you can see that the add call also works and the update should also work. Here I'm going to change this back to, for example, 87, hit send, it works. And finally the delete one. So if I try to use a user that does not exist, let's say you, and if I hit send, you will see that it has caused an internal server error that says converting circular structure to JSON. So here we have a problem. In this case, we are saying deleted score equals to delete score, and we are returning this deleted score here. And that is because we are not using await here. So we need to do that. Let's save this, try this out again. If we hit send now, you can see that the data here is null. And that is because it was not able to find anything that was supposed to be deleted. However, if we delete the record for game 123 and user 123 and hit send, you will notice that we get a proper data back. So what can we do here? We're going to do the same thing as update. We're going to copy this from here because I love copy pasting. And then I'm going to go here and say if the deleted score was null, that meant we couldn't find the score. Otherwise, we are going to return the data that has the deleted score. So I'm going to try this out again. If I now hit send here, because the data was already deleted, you can see it says score not found. Now, if I try to go and get scores, and I can basically pick this user 123444, and if I go to delete now, change the user with the same game ID and hit send, you can see that we only got this data back, and that means our function was successful or our API call was successful. And if I now try to get the score instead of 3, I'm gonna get 2 because I deleted 1. So all our API calls are now working with proper error handling, and they are connecting with the database appropriately. Now that we have this, we can push this code to our repository. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my GitHub and I'm going to create a new repository. I'm going to basically name this Scorer Pro, and I'm going to create this under the CodeWithAhsan team. So I'm going to say Scorer-Pro. I'm going to make this public. We don't need to add any README or anything. So we just create a repository here. Then what we need to do is to use Git. And now it's the part where we actually use Git. So we are going to say something like git init. Once we do so, you can see we initialize an empty Git repository. Now, one important thing to notice is that, as I mentioned before, we don't need to put, or we should not post this env file to any code repository. And we also shouldn't be including node modules. So what we are going to do is to create a new file called .gitignore, and this should ignore any files that we don't want. So I'm going to create this. Then in here, I'm going to include the .env file and then also node modules. So once we save this, you will notice that both of these files are now gray, which means that they are not going to be pushed or included in the Git subversioning system. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do git add dot, which means that all of the files apart from these folders are added. Now I'm going to say git commit -m, and here we are going to say initial commit, and then here I'm going to push this. Now before we push this, I'm going to rename this branch to main. So we can say git branch -m main, and here you can see that the name should be changed to main here, and then I can basically copy some commands from GitHub. So if you look at your repository, you should find this command called git remote. So you need to copy this, paste it here. So you add the remote, and then you need to do git push -u origin main, and this will push all the code that we have to GitHub. And here, if I go and refresh now, you should be able to see your code, or I'm able to see my code here, and I can see all of the code apart from those files that we just ignored. Now that we have this, let's talk about deploying this to production. So you need to go to Heroku and you need to log in via your account. If you have not created an account yet, you can sign up, but I have already an account, so I'm going to sign in using my account credentials, just like this. Once you're logged in, you can create a new application, and remember that when we are creating applications on Heroku, they are on the free tier and they sleep after a while when no one is using that. So you can see here some of my applications, or actually all of my applications, are sleeping because someone was not using them. So you can click new, create new app, and in here you can say Scorer Pro or any name essentially, and then just say, or actually I'm going to say backend, Scorer Pro backend, and in here I can say create app, and in this case you will see some deploy instructions. Now the process that we are going to use is using the Heroku Git CLI or Heroku CLI. So you need to download and install Heroku CLI from here, and you can go through the installation instructions. If you are on Windows, you can just use these installers. If you are on macOS, you need to install it via brew, and if you don't have brew installed, you can go to brew.sh and then copy this command and then just run it on your terminal, and that should install brew. Once you have brew installed, you can run this command and this will install the Heroku CLI. Once you're done with that, you need to log in into the Heroku CLI by doing Heroku login. So I'm going to go to my code and here, or my VS Code, and here I'm going to say Heroku login. And once you do so, it may ask you to press any key to open browser. You're just going to click the login button here, and then you should be logged in. So if I go back to my CLI here, you can see that it says logged in as my email, whatever that is. Now, once you're logged in, you can follow the instructions from the deploy instructions. So here you can see that it says Heroku login, then you need to add this remote just like this. So we are going to copy this command. You don't need to do git init because we already did that. So you need to copy this command, go into your code and paste it there. You will see the message that it set the git remote to this URL. Then you're gonna go ahead and do this. You're going to push to Heroku master. Now, since we have different names, we have a main branch and the Heroku branch is called master. The way to do this is a bit different. You cannot say git push Heroku master. You need to say git push Heroku main master. Now, if we hit enter here, you will see that it will start pushing this to Heroku and will show us the logs as well on what's happening. It will show the whole process, installing dependencies, running the server and whatnot. So if you want to see the logs somewhere else, you can go to your Heroku dashboard and go here and go to view logs. And this is essentially where I usually see all the logs or whatever is happening. Here you can see that it got build succeeded. It tried to do something and then it crashed. And you can see it says Nodemon not found. And that is because by default, it tries to run the npm start command, which we were using while developing, and it was then running Nodemon. Now, as I mentioned in our package JSON, this Nodemon is a dev dependency. This is not a production dependency or not a regular dependency. So when we deploy to Heroku, it essentially removes these. So if you try to check this whole log, you will see it says pruning dev dependencies, and so Nodemon doesn't get installed at the end. So how do we tell Heroku to not run Nodemon but rather node command? To do that, we are going to create a file here. We can say proc file, which is a Heroku specific file. We're going to say this is going to be a web container that would run node, not bide, but rather node. And then we are going to say bin/www. So everything that we have here, just we are replacing Nodemon with node. And the quality of this proc file, or the benefit of this, is that Heroku first tries to look into proc file. And if it doesn't find anything there, then it runs the package JSON. So now that we have this proc file, we can basically add that or include or stage it. And then we are supposed to push this to Heroku. So we are going to do git add dot, then we are going to say git commit -m, and here you could say something like added proc file for Heroku. And once you do so, then you can do git push Heroku and here main : master. So we are pushing to Heroku. Now notice that we are pushing to Heroku. We are not pushing to GitHub. So we would also have to push this to GitHub at some point. In this case, if I go to my logs, you can see that there was another build that is started from my account, and then it is going to do the same thing. It is going to install the dependency, and this time it will start, or it will try to run from the proc file. And this time you can see that it changed from crash to starting. Then afterwards, you can see that starting process with command node bin www. So it didn't run with Nodemon, which is a good thing. But now we got an error, which is Mongoose error. And it says whatever URL you have provided to me for connecting to MongoDB database, it doesn't work. And that is because we did not push our env file to Heroku. So Heroku doesn't have this MongoDB URL. It doesn't have this string. How do we pass this string to Heroku? Because it needs it. So what we are going to do is to create something called environment variable in Heroku. So we are going to go into the settings, and inside here, we're going to go to reveal config vars. We are going to add a variable here called MongoDB URL, and the value, I just copied it. So the key of this variable should exactly be what we have here in the env file. Otherwise, obviously it wouldn't work. Now, after saving this, all you need to do is just click more and click restart all dynos. Once you do so, you should be able to see this in the logs, and you should be able to see it restarting. And now you see MongoDB connected. Yay! That means our application server is now live on Heroku, and it also is able to connect to our database, which means that if I want to just replace my client, which is the REST API client, and the URL from localhost or ngrok to Heroku, it should start working. So if I want the base URL from this, I just want to click open app, and here is the URL, and you can see that we're getting not found because at slash there is no route. But if I go to slash score slash game123 and hit enter, you can see that we get the data. And this is super cool because this is coming from Heroku and this is live on production. So I'm just gonna copy this base URL and I'm going to go to my REST API client from Rapid API, which again is amazing. We're gonna go to environments, manage, and inside here production, we are going to replace this localhost 3000 with this URL. URL, make sure to strip or remove the ending slash because we don't have the slash in the local one, and we add a slash manually in the URL right here, as you can see. So all I need to do is, if I need to switch from local to production, I just click here, click to production, and notice that the code also reflects the changes production URL. And if I try to get the scores from here, you can see that we still get the same data, we still get 200. Okay. And if I add a new data, or if I try to do so, you can see that it says duplicate error key. So I can basically say 123 123, hit send, and that would mean that now using the production URL, we have added a new data into the database, and this has the ID CA3A. So we can confirm it by going to the database, just doing a refresh, and then just searching this value just like this. So we can search something like CA3A, and here you can see that this data was created. So now our API is live on Heroku. Now that we have published our API to production using Heroku, the only thing remaining is to publish our API to Rapid API, so we can basically make it ready for developers to consume and also to start monetizing. So let's get into it. To do so, I want you to go to rapidapi.com/hub and then go to My APIs from there. So you can go to your API settings and we can start adding information there. In here, you should click the definition, and then you can see that there's a stepper form that takes you through all of the required things. So first of all, you can see that we got a short description that we already added, and we could also add a long description. I'm not going to do that yet. If you have a website for this API that you want people to go to, you can add that here as well. And if you have terms of use, you can also add them here. I'm going to go to the next step to add the base URL. In here, you can see that we got this base URL here, and here we need to essentially just add this base URL of our production. So I'm going to click configure here, and here you can see that it says enter base URL. So you can basically copy it from here. You can click open app, and this is the base URL that we'll get out of it. So you can just copy this, and then you can go back to this dialog and just add it right here, and make sure to remove the slash and then hit save. Once you're done with this step, you can go down. I don't really think we have anything else to add here. Then you need to go to endpoints, and this is where things get interesting because here we are going to add our endpoints. So when a developer comes to our API page, they can see a documentation for all those endpoints. So I'm going to just add one or two to just show you, and then I'm going to just quickly add the rest of them behind the scenes. So the first endpoint that we are going to add here is going to be the add score. So I'm going to say add score here, and remember that this endpoint here is different from the REST API client. This REST API client is for me to test my application, but this here essentially is what is going to be shown to the developers who are going to use this API. So I'm going to call this add score, and in here we are going to say add score with game ID and user ID, and here we are going to call this a post endpoint. In here we are going to use the endpoint. So right now we know that we have our base URL, which is this one, and the full endpoint that becomes is /score. So I'm going to just add this score after here. So that's pretty much it. I don't need to add anything in here in the description, so we don't really need that. The body is going to be of type JSON, and we can add it here. Now we already know that there's going to be a game ID here, and then there's going to be a user ID. So we can essentially just say user ID here, and then we can give this the value of game 123, and this is going to be user 123. And finally, we need to add a score here. So we can say something like score. This is going to be, for example, 70, and this is not going to be a string. So this is just going to be a number. Now that we have the body here, you need to click generate schema. So we also have the schema generated for this body. So I'm going to click generate schema, and here you can see that we have this schema generated. Now to actually see the response, or to show the developers what kind of response this API provides us, we could do a couple of things to do so. First of all, we can click this save to test endpoint, which will essentially execute this call using the body that we have provided and then bring a result. And then we can use that result to generate an example response. So why don't we do that? If I click here, you would see that it essentially does a call to our server, but that wouldn't work because we might already have a data just like this. So let's say we do it 123 123 and 123 123. So I'm going to click test endpoint now, and now you should be able to see that we get a result, right? As I suspected. Now we can click here, create example from response, And when we click here, this says example was created from the response. This is very handy for us. And if I go to example responses, I can go down here and see the data here, as you can see. So this is the sample response that we've got, and this sample response is going to be shown in the documentation when someone visits our API page. And this is super cool. Now that we have this response, we can click generate schema to generate the schema as well. Now the fun part is that if I try to click this test point again, this will again make an API call to our server. We'll try to create another record in the database, which is not what we want, because every time someone comes in, they are going to use the same body and execute the same call, and it would start creating records in our database. We don't want that. We want these to be mocked. So instead of making the actual API calls, we can use the mock response. If you see this response heading, you can go here and click mock response. And in here, you can give the status 200. And then the body can be provided just like this. This is the same body that we have in the example response. So this is pretty simple. So you can just save it here and click enable mock response. This will make sure that when someone comes to our API page and starts clicking this test endpoint, it is not going to our server, but rather this response is served as a mock response. So we basically do not create any records in our database. So you need to make sure another thing that this body is equal to what we have in example responses in here. So they should be equal. Otherwise it's going to cause some collision. So I'm going to go to mock responses again, just put it here and hit save. And this API call should now be there. Now at any time of this process, you can click this view in hub to see how this looks when some developer comes in and tries to see the page of this API. So if I open it, you can see that this is this API's page. And right now there is one endpoint that we just created. It's called add score. And in here, you can see the headers, the sample body that we just created. And also you can see the code that they can copy to use our API. They would be using this URL and will get the responses back. Now in here, you can also see that we got example responses. This is where this example response that we just saw when we were looking at it. So the example response that is in here, that is essentially shown on this page here. And finally, if someone clicks this test endpoint, you will notice that we'll get the result similarly here. And this result is again coming from the mock response that we have put here. So you can basically put the same data here and here. So we don't have to make a real API call. I hope you understand my point. Similarly, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to copy this body because we are going to now mock the data for the get API call. So I'm going to save that. And now what I'm going to do is just duplicate this. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to rename this to get scores. And here we can also name this get scores by game ID. In this particular situation, we have the get call and it says that the payload will be deleted. I'm fine with that because we are copying the post call. So I'm going to continue from here, and the get call does have a score, but it also requires a game ID if you remember. And if you don't remember, we can always go to the code. If I go to the route score controller in here, you can see that the router.get has this game ID parameter. How do we give this into the API definition? So in here, you can give it by curly braces, and you can see the message here as well that we can use curly braces here. We can call this game ID just like that. And it already adds this path parameter here, as you can see, and we can give this a default value. We can call this, for example, game 123. And as we are doing that, you can also notice that in the example cases, it is also adding this in the URL as a parameter, and this is super cool. Once we are done with that, we can go to example responses and we can add an example response here. But instead of this entire object that we have, this data would contain an array of objects, because that's what happens. If I go to my actual endpoint here, and if I see this, this is the data that we have. So I'm actually going to copy this whole response and I'm going to mock this, because this data is just me testing things out. It's not production data or any user's data. So I'm going to quickly go and copy this entire object, or actually from the text, just like this. Then I'm going to go to this response, and here I'm going to paste this. Then I'm also going to generate the schema based on this. So I'm going to generate the schema, and now you can see that this is a valid example because we are getting an array out of it. Now that we have this response set, again, we need to go to mock response. We are going to make it 200, and we are going to also paste the same JSON here, which is an array of 2 elements. We are enabling the mock response, which we wanted. And finally, we can hit save. This time we don't need to this because we already got it from our REST API client. So I hope you understand now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this get call to create the update call, and I'm going to call this update score, and here we can say update score using game ID and score ID, and here we are going to make this a put call. This is also going to have the game ID parameter, so this looks good. The path parameter would still have game123 ID. The body, however, would contain the user ID in this case. So I'm going to remove the game ID from here. I'm going to remove, or actually I'm going to keep the score here to make it say 100 in this case. And once we do so, we can basically mock the response that we have. You also need to generate the schema to make sure that we have this defined properly, that this put or this update endpoint basically requires the parameter, but it also requires the body containing the user ID and score. Once we are done with that, we can basically mock the response that we have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially just mock this data, and we are going to mock it. Maybe we could do it something like this. So game123 user123, just making it from a real call, let's say. So if we do 70, if I hit send, it says score not found. That is interesting. So we can maybe add one. So let's say game123 user123, and then we add one, which is 100, and then we update the score by 70. And once we do so, we can copy this response, go back to our API, and in this we basically update this. And we also need to update the schema because this is copied from the get call. So this is using the schema from get, and we want this from the post. So I'm going to just say generate schema, and there we go. Now that we have this, I want to remove all of these headers because I don't really want them to be shown in the documentation, and we would probably have to do this with the other ones as well. But I'm just going to make sure that we have this body here, and we also have this into the mock responses. So I'm going to go to responses, and here in the mock responses, we update this as well, as you can see, and we have 200, and this data looks good. And then I'm going to hit save. Now let's remove the headers from add score as well as from the get score. So I'm going to remove all these headers. We don't really need those. We can just show what response comes rather than the headers. So I'm going to save this now. And in the get call, I just noticed that we also have these headers. So I'm going to just remove them one by one. And once we do so, we can just save this, and that's pretty much it. Now, finally, I'm going to copy this update score call and make it for delete. So we can say delete score, and in here we can say delete score using game ID and score ID. And finally, we are going to convert this into a delete call. This requires a body, but it does not require the score because we only need user ID and game ID. So I'm going to remove that. I'm also going to generate the schema to reflect that. Right now, we already have score. So if we generate the schema, the score is gone. That's cool. And for this one, we can take an example from here. So let's say if we are calling this delete score in which we have user123 being passed here. And if we send this call, we get back this data. So I can copy this one, go here, go down, update this body, generate the schema with this one, and also update the mock response. So I'm going to say mock response, and this one also needs to be updated just like this. And once we have this, we can save this. Now all of our endpoints are up to date. Now if I go to my API hub, you can see that the Scorer Pro here has the get call, the delete call, the add score, and also the update score. And all of the example responses should be there. So here we have this one for put. This one is for add score. Then for delete score, we have a similar one. And for the get score, we should have an array of data. So developers can expect what data would be returned from these API calls. And this is super cool. Now we are almost done. So we're going to go back to our provider dashboard. And the final thing that we need to do is go to plans and pricing and set a pricing plan. In this particular situation, we are going to use the freemium plan, which means that there are going to be some calls that would be for free, and then we can charge very little for an additional set of calls. So in this case, if you preview, this is our basic plan, nothing, and people could subscribe and they are unlimited calls. It's up to you how much you want to charge based on your API, based on your server cost, whatever you want to make out of it. But we are going to change this basic plan in this case. So we are going to edit this, and in this we are going to say the requests are going to be monthly limited. So you could limit, for example, 1,000 requests, and you could do a soft limit per this case. And here you can say that for extra, you could do $0.0001 per extra call. So this is very little. And once you're done with that, you can basically hit save, and that should provide the basic plan. You can also add another plan, for example, Pro. In this one, you could potentially have requests. You can say unlimited here, and then on the very top, you can change the subscription price. So here, the monthly subscription for this one would be, for example, you could say $0.0001 $0.5. So as less as that. You could also enable or disable rate limiting on how many requests per second anyone can make. I'm just going to keep this disabled, and you can also link your DocuSign with this. So anyone who wants to subscribe can basically have an embedded contract with DocuSign. So I'm going to just keep it like this and hit save. And now if we have a look at our plan, you can see that we have a basic one, which is 0 per month, but also 1,000 requests per month. And then there's a very low amount of what the API call would have. Or the person could go pro and have a $0.5 per month with unlimited API calls. That's super cool. And finally, once you're done with that, you can also look into docs where you can add documentation. And if you have any announcements, for example, you want to update your developers or your subscribers about any announcements, about new features, bug fixes, you can basically add them here. But that's pretty much it. If I go now back to my API or API hub, I can refresh this. And in here, you can see I have already subscribed to this, but I can manage the subscription. And that would essentially show me what plan I can pick for this particular API. So in this case, you can see that I've subscribed to the Square Pro automatically since I'm the creator, but I've also subscribed to another API called Meme Generator that I'm using. So there you go. We have our API now published to Rapid API, and you can now get passive income with this API, and possibilities are limitless. You can basically create any sort of API that does something and you can have passive income out of it. And that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you liked the video. If you did, press the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And again, a huge shout out to Rapid API for sponsoring this video and helping us make this video. If there's something that you want me to cover about Node.js, full stack development, merge stack development, Angular, mean stack development, type in the comments, and also let me know if you have watched the complete video. Just type I have watched this full video, and that would make me so happy. As always, happy coding. I'm gonna see you in the next one.